All right, we're now live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Codementor Office Hours. Today we are very glad to do the Hour of Code with Steve Klabnik.
Hi, everybody.
Steve Klabnik is a prolific open source developer and a regular committer to Ruby on Rails. Right now, he's working full-time at Mozilla, and we're very pleased to have him with us again today. So, Steve, let's get started.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So the way to do this, this is a total opportunity for you to ask any questions that you have with Steve. So if you have any questions, feel free to speak up and ask whatever you like.
So we have some questions that are in the side channel, I guess typing rather than speaking, but Akash asks, what do you suggest to beginners, Ruby or Node.js? So I think that this question is always interesting, like where should you start programming? One of the things that I think is really important to remember in this question is that different people learn differently and through different methods. So I don't think that there's necessarily a one-size-fits-all kind of answer to a question of like how should you learn programming. So for example, I love to learn very bottom-up. So I'm the kind of person that learns all of the details and then slowly builds towards the abstractions. But a lot of people learn top-down, where they want to learn the abstractions, then eventually learn the details. And so I think that even within, like, if I told you that you should learn Rails to start with doing like web programming stuff, then there's even multiple ways you could learn Rails, right? So it's a really complicated question. I think that the most important thing, though, for learning something if you're a beginner is to do something that excites you. So, and the second factor is to pick something probably that has a lot of good documentation. So I would personally, to answer your question specifically, I would personally lean towards Ruby as a learning language solely because it is more stable and there is much more help and documentation available. Node and server-side JavaScript is getting kind of old at this point, old being a couple years old. So there is still a wealth of learning material as well. So you wouldn't go wrong if you chose it either.
Ruby is quite hard.
Yeah, you think so? It's interesting.
Yeah, installing Ruby for a beginner is quite hard as compared to a JavaScript. We can render all these things in browser. So we have to install a different Rails, RVM, and all those things. It's quite pathetic for a beginner.
Absolutely. Environment setup is a big problem, and I was thinking about it more in the abstract than that particular answer, because when you said Node, like Node doesn't run in your browser, right? So you still need to install the Node stuff if you're going to be installing the Rails stuff. It's true that like one of the great strengths of JavaScript in learning is being able to just use a web browser because you already have the environment installed. I think that's a really good point.
You don't need to run a Rails server and all those things as well.
There definitely is. I think that we have a lot to learn in terms of how to set things up easily. I try to remember that even getting Hello World going still requires you to like have your compiler or interpreter installed and a text editor and like write all that stuff and put those pieces together is still like a pretty big task. One of the things I really like about the Rails Girls curriculum is that they, if you're familiar with Rails Girls, is an organization that helps women learn Ruby on Rails and some men too. What they do is they do a Friday night social hour plus install fest, and then Saturday is when they actually do the like code. So if you have your own environment set up, you can skip Friday if you want to, but if you want help installing the environment, you do it the day before. So that's continually a big problem with learning programming is setting up an environment, absolutely.
One doubt that if I want to have about 12 web pages in Ruby, okay, I want to render 12 web pages. Can I have all web pages in different layouts? So I need to have a single layout and we have to render the same pages. Can I have 12 layouts for 12 pages?
So Rails gives you the ability to do whatever you want with like rendering of layout. So you can choose to share them between some or all or none of them. It's up to you. By default, there is one layout that applies to all things, but it's a matter of specifying an option that says I want to use a different layout or I don't want to use a layout, and you can do it however you want. Oftentimes, people. I'm sorry.
Any issue with scalability if you're using multiple layouts?
It's not significantly different than using one. I found that most people tend to have two or three. So they have like the marketing side of the site layout, and then the like app part of the site layout, and then sometimes maybe a third one or something.
Being a UI developer, that I'm a UI developer, that we have to be. I'm also developing Ruby as well. That we have a SN file which has about 12 to 15 style sheets. And there is a very confliction that every layout we have to take care of the classes and all those things, because we have to render many style sheets which are not to be used in the single web page.
Right.
So there's rectify this confliction?
There's sort of a conflict here, and there's like multiple ways of doing things, and Rails definitely picks one, but there are other valid ways of doing stuff. So the Rails sort of opinion by default is you want to serve one JavaScript and one CSS file for your entire website, and that way it gets cached on the first request, so you don't need to keep loading different stuff. So the way the Asset pipeline is set up is that all of the individual style sheets that you make end up getting put into one big giant one and then minified and gzipped from there. There definitely are people who think that that is an anti-pattern. I would say that front end is my weakest area of programming, so I won't necessarily like stake my claim on which one is better or best. But I do know that Rails sort of leans you towards the one, but it's totally reasonable to do the other. And you can change that in the configuration options, I think. I just leave it by the default and put everything on one page because it's not my specialty, so I just do what Rails does.
That's the thing I like. I don't like in Ruby that just for rendering a single web page, we have to render the whole style sheet which we had in the project.
Yeah.
That's the pathetic thing I have to deal with Ruby.
Totally. The Asset pipeline has always been controversial since its inception, for sure. It's like one of the most features that people love or hate.
Yes, true. And what for the contribution to open source? How can we start to contribute to open source software or an open source program?
Yeah. So I'm always really interested in this question for a number of different reasons. So I do want to say before I get into how you contribute to open source that I think that it's okay if you don't contribute to open source. I like to tell this story. I was thinking about it the other day. I was talking with someone about this issue, and there was a person doing some construction outside the window, and I was like, I bet that jackhammer guy doesn't go home and do open jackhammering projects on the weekends, right? Like, it's his job. So I'm with the small caveat that I think it's totally fine if you don't contribute to open source. If you want to, there's a number of different ways. For me personally, the way that I've always found to get involved in open source projects is to work on something you actually use. So you need in order to motivate yourself, you need a stronger goal than just broadly speaking, I want to contribute. Even shaving it down to, I want to contribute to Rails will help you significantly in actually accomplishing your goal, because the more you can articulate what you want to accomplish, the more likely you are to get it done. So, for example, with me, I said, I want to start contributing to Rails. And so what I did was I went and looked through all of the open issues at the time and read all of them. And what that did was that enabled me to sort of understand where a lot of the pain points and problems were. I'm trying to lean out of the sun. It's funny. My curtains aren't very great. But I read through all the issues, and that led me to understand a lot of things that were kind of wrong or hard or difficult. I've always had a love for documentation, and that's definitely an area that almost every single project needs help with. But a lot of people find writing documentation to be very boring, so I think that might be an avenue to get started, but not necessarily for everyone. But once I read all these issues, I sort of said, okay, here's one that seems pretty easy. I'm going to try to fix it. And then I spent a couple days trying to fix this problem, slogging through and just working hard at it. And eventually I found a fix. And submitted it, and it got accepted. And I was like, wow, that's really great. And so I picked a second one, and then that one only took me 2 days instead of 3 days. And one of the weird things about contributing is it's never harder than at first. So your first couple patches will feel like a huge, massive effort, but the more and more that you do it, the easier and easier it gets. The more familiar you are with the tools, and most people use GitHub these days, so the more you get familiar with GitHub's interface and the way that it works, the sort of easier it is to contribute. So I've been thinking about, I don't really have any answers, but I've been thinking about the fact that it's actually harder for new people to contribute than for existing people to contribute just by default, and I'm not sure how we can fix that as a problem, but it's definitely something that's true.
True, true. What about interaction of Ruby with Angular? I think it's not so compatible with Angular and Ruby contribution.
Yeah, so I will say that number one, I barely write any JavaScript. So my opinions on JavaScript stuff is mostly like from an architectural perspective rather than from a like in the trenches building it perspective. And number two, I tend to be on Team Ember, so I've not actually used Angular in any significant capacity. I have some small beefs with their like architectural choices, although I think they're legitimate. You can look at Angular and Ember in these really interesting ways, and I think that a lot of times there's these technical choices which have a valid choice on either side, and like Angular picked one and Ember picked the other, and so you sort of need to like figure out which one is good for you. In my case, that's Ember, but I don't think it's unreasonable to use Angular. Like I said, I don't even write that much front-end stuff, and it's a weak point of mine, so you should take everything I say about front-end stuff with a grain of salt. But I do know that there is definitely a degree of conflict to the way that people build single-page apps and like the way that Rails works. Rails very much wants to own everything that you're doing, and the integration, like if you look at the way that people use things like Bower or Broccoli as compared to the way that Asset Pipeline does stuff, you know, there's definitely some degree of conflict there. I think that Rails 4.2 made some of that a little bit easier, but I'm not 100% sure about the details. But yes, there's also sort of a question of should those things live in the same project. So it's super common to have Rails be just an API server with like your entire front end being Angular. And so the question is, do those even belong in the same Git repository, or are they two separate projects? And like, how do you do all that kind of stuff? So yeah, I think that there's a little bit of a Wild West, and there's lots of good opportunity for people to figure out best practices for sure.
Perfect. Got it. Yeah.
Hi, Steve.
Hello.
I have a question that I'm Ruby on Rails programmer.
Sure.
I have many. Our company has many subdomains. Every subdomain is a Rails application.
Yeah.
Sometimes those applications need to communicate. So now I use API for communication each other, but it's not very efficiency, and sometimes because one of the application is single sign-on server, which means I want to analyze all the users' actions. I need to cross the database because there are different applications. I want to build an analytic application for multiple database, but it's not the normal way in Ruby on Rails because the normal way is a single DB.
Yeah.
So I found some gens like Connection Ninja or some gens support this one, but is that a good way to do?
So this is also a really interesting area that's like shaken out a lot in the last couple of years. What I will say is that starting by having an app, by using the database to share communications between two applications,
yes.
Is something that works well when you start, but eventually it causes problems. A good way to sort of explain this is job queues, actually. So this is why originally in Rails we had the delayed job gem, which would store your background jobs in a database, and then your job runner would be reading the database, and then it would find the jobs and execute them and put the results back in. What ended up happening in that situation, and it's very similar with like two different applications sharing a database for communication purposes, what ends up happening is that you introduce a lot of contention on your database because the second and first application, if they both need access to the same table and if they're scanning the same tables, they have to wait for the other one to be done, and it can introduce a lot of like I/O overhead. So in the job queue situation, what we started to do was use other databases just for the job queue. So for example, Rescue uses Redis. And that way your jobs stay in Redis and your main code stays in your database, and then there's no more contention about feeding that stuff. So I would say that Rails is kind of bad at accessing multiple databases from a single Rails app. But I'm not entirely sure that's necessarily bad, because I think that you sort of paint yourself into a corner when you try to do lots of multi-database things. One approach to solving this is may not be appropriate until you're a little bit bigger. There's always a balance, right? Like when you start off, you want to do like dirty hacks that just get things done, and then eventually you're like, oh, I need to do this the right way. But if you do it the right way from the start, you may never even ship. So, you know, as with all questions, there's like a lot of balance and sort of like judgment that needs to be done. But a pattern that I've seen people do, which is really useful, is to introduce an internal-only service that owns that particular database. So, for example, if your service 1 and your service 2 both need to communicate in some way, they will both talk to internal service 3, and that service will like handle you know, that kind of information. And so I think that kind of, rather than just having them access the raw database directly, I think that going through a service that can control those kinds of things and lets you like monitor the contention and doesn't introduce more contention on your regular databases either is like a good pattern. I will say that I'm not a big fan of HTTP for internal-only services. HTTP was designed for communicating like across boundaries, like organizational boundaries. Well, I mean, it was designed for a lot of things, but like the scalability problems that you sort of mentioned in some ways, like HTTP is not good when you control both ends of the pipe. So I tend to prefer things like Captain Proto or like a binary, like super low-level protocol for communicating inside of my network and building internal APIs that way, and then only using HTTP for external-facing APIs. I would never expose a Captain Proto API to the world, but I would never use HTTP internally either, because their protocols are good at different things. But the SOA style is definitely something that there are a lot of people that are going like really extremely SOA, and some people just build 1 or 2 services. I found that people do this for refactoring Rails apps too, where like they build one app and it's too big, so they start breaking chunks out. So there's a lot of different ways you can go for sure. But yeah, if your two apps need to communicate with each other, I would build in the same way that like a good way to design software is to name your concepts. This is like an object-oriented programming principle, is that if there's a concept in your system, it should have a name and therefore be its own class. In your architecture, if there's something that's like that important between your 2 applications, it should have its own name and therefore should probably be its own service. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this makes sense. So I have a simple case that I only need to analytic data, so it's read only. That would be safe.
Yeah, that's definitely an area where it's much easier.
Yes.
And reading a lot can still introduce contention, but is much less likely to do so than read and write traffic, absolutely. So that might be a good area. Like I said, you need to use judgment at certain points, and so that sounds like an area where it wouldn't be that bad just to have just read-only access to another database, yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, next
but
question.
You're definitely right that it's awkward to use from Rails. For sure, and that's something that could be better. It's just not as many people. One of the funny things about open source is that the things people do all the time are really good and well supported, and the things that people don't do all the time get a little sketchy, right? So if people start to do it more, maybe it'll get better in the future. Anyway, sorry, I don't want to cut you off. I just wanted to
it's fine. Thanks. My next question is okay. I have a big application. I want to separate the front. The backend and front.
Mm-hmm.
In 2 repository, which means the only thing they have to be sync is the model. Yeah, but others like controller or views is totally different because they are normally we put one in like at the mean,
right?
At the mean scope, and others are just normal. I want to separate them, but I want to solve the sync model, sync the models. Before I use git submodule to do that, but git submodule will pull a whole normally front end of either backend into another one, but it's very, very huge. The other way I think about is to make another gen, but it's an engine only contain the model. But I don't know, is there any good way, or I need some suggestions.
So I haven't deployed this personally, so again, grain of salt here, but I've heard people that use the second way, we made a gem with an engine that just contains our models and we include it in multiple apps. I've heard from people that I talked to that has worked well for them in the past. And one other thing you can do too that's sort of a more advanced version of this trick is Bundler actually allows you to run multiple gem servers. So you could actually like run an internal only gem server and just host your model gem from that. And then it will pull that from that and other things from Ruby gems. That's an area, again, I haven't done that, but I've heard about some large organizations doing things like that. But it definitely seems to me like the engine's approach is the right one. But yeah, since I haven't deployed it, I can't tell you how painful it is. But that would be what the path I would take.
Okay. Okay, cool.
Yeah. The interesting thing about engines is that like a Rails engine is actually kind of a Rails application.
Yes.
And so it tends to be like similar. Engines are a really interesting long story with Rails stuff.
Yes.
I guess I don't want to get into all that history, but in modern Rails, the engines definitely are like a way you can reuse functionality that way. And there's lots of cool stuff that you can do that's sort of not done as often because the APIs are newer. But yeah, engines are the way to go, I would say.
Yeah. Did you hear anybody use like Git submodule way?
Everyone that I've heard that uses Git submodules for anything ends up being unhappy with them in some capacity.
Okay.
I think they're okay. We use them for the Rust project that I work on. The new programming language is my day job now, and it's okay for like vendoring things, but it just seems like, and it's gotten better in newer versions of Git, but historically submodules have always just been like a really awkward thing in Git style, and so
Yes.
I try to avoid them whenever possible, personally.
Okay, me too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, these third questions. I hear Akan talking about Node.js.
Yeah.
I want to ask him about the DRY issue. In backend we use Ruby, and in frontend we use JavaScript. Sometimes they are the same. I mean, sometimes you need the same logic and implement in Ruby and in JavaScript, but they are the same code almost, just different languages. If we use Node.js in backend and backend and the frontend is JavaScript, the code can be reused, so it's DIY. But yeah.
So this is true, and this is something that some people do. I personally, so one thing that's important to remember is that DRY is actually the short name for the saying. What's really interesting about programming like slogans and these like maxims is that we like to remember the short version but not the long version.
Yes.
So the actual thing behind DRY is there should be one unambiguous representation of a concept in your system. And so in your system is the key part here. So for me personally, I like to keep the front end and the back end boundaries very divided. And so to me, if you need to repeat a little bit of logic in both places, that's because they're two different systems. And so therefore, like, it's not a violation of don't repeat yourself because they're isolated from each other by the network boundary. Now, there are definitely people who disagree with me on this fact. Sorry, let me make that go away. There are people who disagree with me on this fact, and in fact, the biggest example you can see of this is a frameworks like Meteor, right? And so, like, I really dislike this approach personally because I see it as papering over a systems boundary that's very, very important to pay attention to. But, you know, I am not the master of all programming, and so some people want to build it both ways. I've found that if you try to reuse your server-side code in your client-side, even if they're both JavaScript, that you tend to end up with problems anyway. I don't have any experience with those directly. That's, again, just like my network talking, which is always filtered through the kinds of people you're friends with, right? But the only kind of logic that I can see as being legitimately shared is validations. If you don't want to make a network round trip, that's like the big one that everyone talks about. But and I can sort of see. I can feel okay about sharing validations across the boundaries so that you don't have to make those kinds of network round trips. But for almost everything else, it seems to me like making a giant ball of mud instead of two cleanly separated systems, personally.
Okay.
But again, front end is my super weakness. So, you know, I like to joke that I'm turning 29 next month, and I like to joke that I'm secretly a really old man. So part of that might have just be, oh, these new kids and their JavaScript on both ends kind of thing. But I feel like the client and the server need to be separate, and that's just like having a hard boundary is useful.
Okay, it's fine. I want to know more songs about that.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And I definitely think there's lots of value, I should say as well. One of the best things that Node has ever done is it enabled people to write backend code that could never do it before. So like that aspect of only having one programming language on both parts of the service boundary is really appealing for bringing new people into programming. And I think that for the flaws that Node has, like every technology, I think that its greatest accomplishment was allowing a new subset of people who had never written backend services to write new backend services, and I think that's really great. So there definitely is some value in like using the same language on both ends of the boundary. I like to use two different languages personally, but you know.
Okay. Last question. I know you recently using learning and teaching Rust. There are many new languages recently, like Go or Python. Others is there. Why you choose Rust?
So this story starts 2 years ago, actually. Actually, almost exactly 2 years ago. In like 2 weeks, it'll be 2 weeks from now. It'll be 2 years ago. I went home to visit my mom for Christmas. And I come from a very small town where we have farms like with cows and stuff, so there's not a whole lot to do there compared to bustling New York City where I live now. And so I was just reading Reddit and Hacker News and stuff, and this announcement came across and said, Rust 0.5 has been released. And at the time, the pitch for Rust was the type safety of Haskell, the concurrency of Erlang, and the speed of C++. And I went, wow, type safety, concurrency, and speed are the three things that Ruby is terrible at. I should learn this language because it'll teach me a whole lot, from my normal language that I use all the time.
Yeah.
And so that's what got me interested in it. The reason I stuck with Rust is because in college I used to do a lot more low-level programming. I actually didn't start web stuff until my very first internship out of college. And like a lot of my friends in college were actually operating systems PhDs and researchers. And so after doing web for the last 4 or 5 years, I kind of really miss the low-level stuff. And so I got excited working on Rust just because it's a new area that I haven't had to think about for a while, and it's always really fun for me. So that's why I got involved. Today, the main reason I'm still involved and why I'm like doing a bunch of Rust work is that these low-level programming languages come along once every like 10 or 20 years. And I'm really excited to see some like new. So we actually have taken a lot of the lessons from Ruby and JavaScript and Python and taken them into the Rust world to help improve the like low-level tooling. So I'm really excited about the kind of work that's happening with Rust in general. But it's definitely not something that's for everybody. But I would encourage people who have an interest in systems or low-level programming to definitely check it out. This is really great. I think it's a great language.
Okay, thank you.
Very welcome. Who's next?
So I'm kind of late to the party. I just joined the hangout. My name's Chris Pollock.
That's all good. Hey, Chris.
Nice to meet you. So I'm assuming that we just ask you questions and we can get some cool answers.
Anything you want to know, I am an open book.
Okay. Well, I'll give you a scenario then. I'm trying to build a Ruby on Rails application. It's I'm kind of new to programming.
Cool.
Just went through a General Assembly boot camp.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm not
I
sure.
am,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. And I'm trying to build a what you see is what you get website builder.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just having problems kind of like thinking about it as a whole. So, I mean, I understand the concept of a content management system and how to create one. It's basically that. But actually deploying that for people to like hook up their own domain names to it, and then using like I was trying to build a custom WYSIWYG editor instead of using like CK editor or
TinyMCE, I think, is the one that I always end up using.
Exactly. Yeah, right. Do you have any suggestions of where I should start? Because I've built the content management system for the most part, but I'm just kind of stuck on how to get it to deploy for each user and building that last part for the domain name integration.
Yeah. So whenever whenever I'm trying to learn how to do new stuff, or if there's like a big project where I have lots of things that I need to figure out, I try to just pick a particular concrete task and attack that. So I would say like choose one of those things and then try to take a deep dive into that specific problem and just like work on it until you've solved it yourself. And then like try to go on to other ones. If you end up bouncing around between stuff, one of the things interesting about programming is that oftentimes it has a lot of context that you're like holding in your head, and so it's so funny that I would say this because I shift context constantly, but like I'm a weird person in that regard, I would say, and I could probably be better if I didn't switch context so often. But when trying new things, especially focusing on one thing and just working on it until you're done has been an approach that's worked well for me in the past. The one thing I will say about the kind of stuff you're trying to accomplish is that there's a number of different ways to do it, and so it sort of also depends on the way that you want to choose. So, for example, deploying them for each user, you can organize a sort of a site like this as either one big giant app where everyone has a specific subdomain, or you can do it as each individual subdomain is a separate instance of your app with those configuration changes. And I'm not entirely sure which one of those approaches is better, but I guess I just wanted to bring that up as an illustration of like there are multiple ways of tackling this problem that have different pros and cons. And this is like the number one thing that you'll see as you learn more about programming is that like everything has this like you could do this or this, and there's good stuff and bad stuff for both of them. So pick one. And you kind of have to like that's where the judgment comes in, and that's why when some people talk about programming as being like an art or an engineering field, it's because like you have to like weigh these different trade-offs. So that's basically, I guess, what I would say is just that like you should tackle one of those problems and then go on to the next one and then go on to the next one, and sort of like in a broader macro sense. In terms of like super WYSIWYG stuff, it depends on how far you want to get into it. So I will say that doing this is like a very hard problem in general, and I know like teams of professional good programmers that take long times to build stuff like this. So don't get discouraged if it seems a little harder. Making a website that makes websites is a pretty ambitious project.
Right.
So a simple thing that you can get away with that sort of helps instead of doing full WYSIWYG that a lot of sites do is just like Markdown. So you let people edit Markdown text, and then that lets them do basic styling without having to like get into full on like big WYSIWYG editors. But yeah, so I don't know if that helps in the sort of broad strokes. If you want to talk about any of the like specific ones, we can dig into like one of those specific problems. But yeah, I would say just in general, that's how I try to tackle big projects. Is like, what's that saying? What's the best way to eat an elephant? One bite at a time, or something. Right. I think.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, no, that helped me out a lot. I was actually going for the first approach, which is one big app and multiple subdomains. For the WYSIWYG editor, I was doing a lot of research with JavaScript, and I didn't realize that they had like the content editable and like so I was trying to use that to do it and just have it. So the one specific is I'm trying to figure out a way to render a full page for the WYSIWYG without using iframes, because inherently most sites use iframes. Like if you look at like CK Editor or Mercury or something like that. I was thinking about using like a yield or render through Ruby or something like that, but then figuring out how to edit that using JavaScript and save it was kind of tricky.
Yeah, so usually what ends up happening is if you're building a site like this, the Ruby will sort of render what your current existing page is, and that just gets put out. And so that sort of like functions all like normal. And then from there, what you do is you write your JavaScript so that you click like on an edit button, and then that makes those areas editable. And then when you click the save button, you'd like check up what those changes are, and then you make an AJAX call back to the server, letting it know that like, hey, this is updated. And then you just leave it that way. You don't like re-render it from the server side again or anything. You just like leave it the way that it is. And so that might be where you were like running into complication, is like re-rendering the page over again is a problem. In terms of replacing the whole page, if you just replace the body tag, then that should be virtually everything on the page. A lot of stuff, so for example, as much as I dislike it, the TurboLinks gem does something very similar in the sense that it only replaces the body tag and the title tag, and that's it. And so if you took a similar approach with the WYSIWYG stuff, where like once you click save, maybe the JavaScript will send it to the server, and then you just like redraw the whole body, would be an approach that's relatively simple. I will say that there is a lot of research right now. One of the hotter topics in the JavaScript world is how to efficiently re-render chunks of your page. You can see entire frameworks devoted around researching this concept. So React, for example, has been, from Facebook, has been a massive like step forward in terms of figuring out how to efficiently re-render the page. And so there's a rich area for you to explore as someone new to programming, that like this is actually a pretty hard problem. Yeah. Totally.
Yeah, I made the mistake of trying to do this as we have 3 projects at General Assembly that we have to do, and I made the mistake of thinking this was going to be an easy task, and it wasn't.
I used to have a startup, and my co-founder had done a little bit of programming, but not really. And it's so funny how we like set expectations very early on. I was like, you have no connection to what is difficult and what is easy. So you might ask me for something and you think it's going to be very trivial, and I'm going to be like, that's really difficult. And then you might ask me for something you think is going to be very impossible, and I'm going to say, oh, that's really easy. I saw a comic, I think it's an XKCD, but I'm not sure, that was talking about this problem where they were talking about, like, I have a photograph and I want to upload it to the website, and the programmer says, that's really easy. And then they say, I would like to know what state the photograph is taken in. And the programmer's thought bubble says something like, oh, geofencing, that's pretty easy. I can just like hook up the map data with the information that's embedded in the image, and like that'll be cool. So he responds, oh, that'll be really easy. And then say, and I want to know if the photo is a photo of a bird or not. And the programmer's like, wait, that's really impossible. And it like shows this disconnect, right? Like which state it's in and is this a bird or not sound like very similar questions, but are actually like orders of magnitude more difficult. So it can definitely be really easy to bite off more than you can chew. But the cool thing about doing that is it means you're going to learn a lot. So I actually really like really hard projects. As long as you can be not frustrated by the fact that it may take you a very long time to finish them, because the harder the project, the more you have to learn, which can be really nice, as well. That's like the positive side. Plus, it feels so much better when you finally accomplished it.
Right.
So like I have spent, when I took over one Ruby project called Shoes, it took me 6 months to even figure out how to compile it. And so I pretty much was just like banging my head off the wall day after day for months. And when I finally fixed it, it was like the best feeling I've ever had. So I don't know.
That's cool.
Don't give up.
That's cool. I appreciate it. That helps out a lot. I don't want to hog all the questions. I know I'm late, so I have a lot of questions. But
yeah, it's all good.
So when you said that basically if I did an Ajax call just to save the body tags, basically the content that I changed, is the best approach, you think?
Yeah, in general, it might so one of the hard parts then is like when you just save the contents of the page, you're sending the HTML, not the data. So then you have to like re-engineer that on the server side a little bit, and so it gets kind of tricky. But just in general, that like architectural approach of the JavaScript sends off the changes is like the basic idea. But there's a lot of hidden complexity for sure, because it's an inherently hard problem.
Okay.
And you sort of have to figure out what degree of difficulty. One of the things about engineering, right, is that like building a like commuter vehicle and a race car are two very different things, and so you would get away with stuff in a commuter car that you wouldn't put into a race car, and like vice versa. So it's important to decide like which edge cases you want to handle. A lot of times you can do 80% of the work, and that's totally okay, and the 20% is stuff that people don't ever really use, and so it's not important to have it 100% right. So you might find that with a project like this too, that like as long as it's like mostly right, everything's cool. You can spend a lot of time tracking down the last 1% of bugs in a project.
Yeah, cool. Now I was also trying to figure out how I could yield, because my content management system right now that I have set up is just like a basic form, right? Figure out how to actually render pages on there. Should I use like create a layout and set my Rails application and yield those pages, or should I what's the best approach for like displaying
That sounds reasonable to me, at least with like the level of discussion that we've talked about. So you might even, if on those pages, if the whole body is being replaced by JavaScript, you might actually just want to like have the layout be literally just the body, and then have everything else, be part of the view. Oftentimes in layouts, you have like the menu bar and stuff goes in the layout, right? But you might want to just pull it out to a very simple layout where just the body goes in the yield tag, and then the model's responsible for generating all of the rest of the stuff that goes in there. It really depends, and there's a ton of different ways you can do it, and so, yeah.
Okay. I think you gave me a lot of insight. So I've been working on this for a couple months now, so it's been interesting. So
it's really cool to see all those kinds of projects that you guys build. I'm familiar not just with General Assembly, but a lot of other like similar bootcamp style programs, and always there's like the project students come up with are super neat. So.
Yeah, it was funny because ironically, when I told my instructors that this was the reason I took this program was because this is the idea that I always wanted to build. And when I told them that, they were like, "Do not build this. You will not be able to do it." Basically, right? And I'm like, "Oh, it can't be that hard. Like, it sounds like a basic CRUD application. It should be pretty simple." And then as I started getting into it, I was like, "Holy hell! What the hell was I thinking?" So but it's cool. I learned a lot from it. So.
Yeah, I'll also say that different people find different things easy. So, for example, I know people that don't do web programming because they think that operating systems programming is easier. They're like, I write assembly code on one computer and it just does what I tell it to. That's simple. You wrap up a markup language and a programming language and a styling language and then send it across the network to run on a totally different computer that's running a different operating system, and you expect it to work properly. Like, that's really hard. So we all have different strengths and weaknesses, and so it just depends. You might find this, you might do something else and find that it's even easier or harder. I like to try to shy away from telling beginners that anything is like impossible for them, because you never know, like whenever you're going to come across a student that really does have an intuition for CMSs, it's possible, right? There's so much. We're all different in so many ways.
Well, I'm sorry, one last. So the subdomains. Now, how would I set that? How would you go about setting that up if I was to do subdomains and set that up for my application? Because I am new to this. So how would I?
Yeah. So this involves a system called DNS, which I am admittedly really terrible about. There are a number of really great blog posts about how to set up subdomains for your Rails application, and so you should just Google it and follow them, because that would literally be what I would do. Is like Google that right now and just read the page to you, basically. That's something that I've done it for 2 or 3 projects, and I always just end up Googling it and following the instructions. So, but it's a pretty well-trod path. Is like a subdomain per user is pretty common. So there's good documentation on that.
Cool. Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. Like I said, I don't want to ask too many questions because I could talk to you. I could talk to you for the whole hour.
That's all good. I will say too, as a last comment, that a lot of beginners underappreciate the degree to which Googling things is what programmers' jobs are. Like, sometimes I think my job is more about knowing how to search for something than it is actually programming. And also, I lean on my friends' network a really large amount. I would not nearly be as good of a programmer as I am, quote unquote, if I didn't have a large network of friends that helped me out whenever I had a question, and that I helped them out back in turn. Programming is a really social activity, so don't be afraid to ask for help from other people, and help them back if they need help, because that's like the only way we ever get things done. I have a friend who's good at this, and I have a friend who's good at that, and a friend who's good at this, and when I have a problem, I'm like, oh, I know, I can ask them about this kind of topic, and they'll be able to help me out. So no man is an island. I'm full of cheesy phrases today, I think.
I appreciate it. You actually remind me of my instructor that I had. His name was Jesse Shaw. I don't know if you know him, but he's.
I don't know if I do.
Yeah, he's really cool. You really remind me of a lot. So yeah, thanks. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Anytime. Anybody else?
Yeah, was concerned about the big companies dealing with front-end developer, that you have worked on Ruby in backend. So how you communicate with the front-end developer? So you made their routes configured, you make the Rails says configured. So what's the procedure I think in Mozilla? How do you communicate with front-end developers? when
So
Yeah.
with Mozilla, because I'm working on a programming language, we don't really have front-end and back-end people. So I can't tell you what Mozilla does. I do know that what I've done in the past at various startups and consultancies and whatever that I've worked for is that my preferred way of working with the front-end people is to actually have them sort of be in charge, because ultimately the front end is what the users see, and that's what matters at the end of the day. So I try to get the front end developer to tell me what they need from me, and then a lot of times I'll actually like sketch out a route that just returns dummy data. So like here's just an endpoint, and it's going to just return you JSON, and that JSON is going to be fake, and you can just do it. And then they can work on all their stuff, and then I can work on implementing it so that it submits the real JSON, and then we put the two things together, and everything works well. Obviously, sometimes you need to go through rounds of iteration and revision in that kind of sense. But this is why I like that firm client-server distinction, is because then you know that's where you like come together, right? Is like the JSON is where we all meet and sit around the JSON and talk about what needs to go on or whatever. But so that's what I've done is like you mock out a route that just spits out some JSON, and they work with that, and then you tweak it basically.
So what about in Ruby? Ruby, we have a app folder where we have assets and all those things. So you configure the routes .rb folder for the front-end developers as well, because they also have to work on the Ruby itself.
Right. Usually we have a branch, and we're both working on the same branch. So like I'll push up a commit, and then they'll pull it down and like do that kind of stuff.
Okay. So you configure their routes as well.
Yeah, I would set up the route. We would talk about it, and if you're following, Rails has such strong conventions that usually what the names of the routes are is pretty obvious. You don't need to do a lot of discussion around what your URLs look like. But if you weren't doing something like Rails, or you wanted to invent your own convention, I would like first talk about the URLs should be, and then I would like set those up as the backend person with just dummy data. Mm-hmm.
Got it. Sure. Got it.
Yeah, inter-team communication is like a whole nother can of worms. It's a really hard problem. It's one of the reasons I've been joking that I've been doing less actual coding lately and more like high-level work, is just because coordinating teams of programmers is its own gigantic thing we don't really know how to do well yet.
True.
Anybody else? We got like 10 minutes left.
What about the terminal knowledge? So you have the knowledge of SSH and all those things as well?
My internet got a little weird there. I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said. What was it?
What about the terminal knowledge, that you work on SSH and shell script, all those things as well?
Yeah, so I've been programming for a very long time, which I don't think is a prerequisite to be good at programming. I know lots of programmers who started at the end of college or after college and are fantastic programmers. But one of the things is that technology always changes, which means the languages and technology is always working on changes. And so eventually you will accumulate this knowledge of all these other things. And so, yeah, I actually, let's see, I have a Ruby... There's the camera. I have a Ruby tattoo, and I have a little Perl camel too. It's smaller, so I won't put it up there. But I used to do Perl before I did Ruby, and I loved it. So people have been joking about when are you going to get a Rust tattoo, and I'm like, someday. Like, give it a couple years yet. But I like to think of myself as a programmer first and a like languageist second. There will be a day when all of the programming languages we use aren't used anymore. Just like, if I had started in the 80s and I was talking about certain forms of assembly code, right? Like there are certain areas where that's still used, but for the most part, it's all gone. So that'll happen to all the technologies, no matter how good or bad. There will be a day when no one uses Rails anymore. That's just the way that works.
Sure.
So I have a question. When you first started programming, like, what was how did you start, and what resources did you use?
Yeah, so I will say that I usually try not to make a big deal out of this because I think that it's a stereotype that is like overall harmful, but I'm one of those kids that started as a little kid. I was 7 when I originally started programming. But the thing that's funny about that is that, and the reason I say it's a harmful stereotype is that the work that I did from 7 to, let's say, 12 is like a week's worth of the work that I did from like 22 to 23, right? So those years, like 1 year of time is not worth 1 year of programming experience because it changes over the course of what you've been doing. So for me, I started like back before I had home internet access. So it was like, here's a book, here's a basic interpreter, have at it. And like I knew there were games and I wanted to build them, and so I just spent all my time screwing around with programming stuff. I don't think that is one path to programming, but I don't want to discourage anyone who did not start as a child because I don't think it's strictly necessary. And there are lots of bad habits that you can get when you start programming as a little kid when nobody's like telling you what to do and do correctly, right? So it's a double-edged sword for sure. But yeah, I would say that the biggest thing to learning programming stuff is just being willing to not give up. And just being persistent and not being afraid of failure. I like to say that like test-driven development, right? It's red and red and red and red and then green and then red and red and red and red and then green. And so like most of the time we are failing. Like most of the time, if all of our programs were feature complete and had no bugs, programming would not be a thing. So like by the fact that we are programming means that either we don't have enough features yet or our software has problems. So in some way as a programmer you're always failing, which is a weird mindset to get into, but like, you know, you just have to be okay with things not being perfect and not working because that's like literally our job. And that comes in with learning too. Like things are very, very hard and you work at them and then eventually they get easy because you've worked at them a really long time.
That's cool. I never thought about constantly failing. Yeah, that's the truth.
I try to remember when I get sad and angsty on Twitter and I send a lot of sad tweets about how computers are terribly broken. You know, I could do that every day because they're always broken. But that's what gives us stuff to do, right? Is to fix them.
So now, how else have you learned since you said you started at 7, but like as you got older and you started learning newer languages, how are you able to pick up these newer languages like where they're like
so there's broad paradigms that programming languages fall into, and there's sort of like a family tree of programming languages. So if you know a language that's similar to another one, it can be very easy to pick up. So for example, and both Python and Ruby, people will hate me for saying this, but like Python and Ruby are like almost the same programming language. And it's true there's a lot of differences, and like culturally there's huge differences, but like they're almost the exact same thing. So learning one when you know the other is very easy. However, if you go from a dynamically typed object-oriented programming language like Perl or Python or, well, sort of Perl, but Ruby, and you switch to a statically typed functional programming language like, say, Haskell, that's going to be a very difficult jump because it's significantly different. It's like a totally different branch of that family tree. It also means you'll end up learning a lot. So I'll say that some languages are easier and some languages are harder to pick up. It's easier if you stay within a paradigm, and it's harder if you jump paradigms. Now, in terms of actually doing the learning, usually what I do is just I try to write. I have a project that I do in every new programming language that I learn, and that's a text adventure game, like go north, go east, attack goblin or whatever. And I try to do that when I learn new programming languages. And that way I have a program that I know I've built in another language, so I know I can do it, but I want to explore how the new programming language does things, so it'll end up looking a little bit different. And so that's usually what I do, is just try to write some code and read lots of tutorials and stuff.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's mostly just putting in the time, frankly. Just like any other skill. The more you practice it, the better you get.
Quick question. Is now a good time to learn Rust?
So I would say that for some people now is a good time. For other people, give it 6 or 12 weeks. So basically, like right now, today we announced the 1.0 schedule. And so what's going to end up happening is on Friday, January 9th, is when the alpha release is coming out. And so the alpha release means we're going to try not to break anything, but we might break some things. And then 6 weeks after that, in February, is going to be the beta release. And after the beta release, we're saying we're not going to break anything unless we absolutely have to. So I would say that for most people, that day, February 16th, is like the best time to start learning Rust, because then things won't be changing. So for example, this morning, an entire redo of the standard library's I/O was like announced. So we're still making lots of big changes, and most people don't want to learn things with big changes. So if you want to learn Rust, I would say that waiting until February is the best thing to do. But if you're willing to relearn things as they change, now is a great time to learn Rust, because we're making those last couple breaking changes, and like you could have an influence on them if you wanted to. So it really just depends on what your goals are. If your goal is to learn a new Finnish language, you should wait. If you want to try out it's very rare that you get to like play with a programming language before it's done, you know. And so if that's appealing to you, learn it now. If that scares you, just wait until February.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, 2 minutes. One last question.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to say thank you. If we wanted to connect with you offline, I guess
just send me a tweet or an email or anything, whenever. That's fine. I will say that I'm very bad at reading emails, so it might take me a couple days/weeks to get back to you. I'm like particularly bad right now. I have so many emails I need to answer, but I do answer them eventually. So feel free to email or contact me absolutely with anything, and I will try to help you out.
And how open are you with I know you're on Codementor as well, right?
Yeah, I am. I don't do a whole lot of those hours because I've been trying to get Rust 1.0 shipped.
Okay.
But yeah.
Okay. Okay. So if we ever needed help with professional help, because I've run into a few issues, and we just needed to chat offline, you'd probably be available after the 16th, you think?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Appreciate it.
Anytime.
All right, so awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. Really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. Great questions, everyone.
So guys, yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for attending, and thanks a lot to Steve. If you have any ask Steve any additional questions, Steve can be reached at his Twitter account @SteveKlabnik.
See you later.
All right, thank you guys. Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you.